Floyd Breeding had been sitting in the third pew at Mount Carmel Baptist Church, same as he had every Sunday for the past 47 years, listening to Birdie sing with the choir in that soft alto voice that had carried him through every trial and comfort of his life, his calloused hands folded neat across his worn Bible. When back home, on his 40-acre homestead in Grayson County, Virginia, a pump truck with its diesel engine rumbling was backing up to his spring-fed pond, the same pond his granddaddy had deeded and filed with the county in 1923, the pond that had fed every generation of breeding since before automobiles were common, and that pump truck was draining every last drop of water out of it while nobody was there to stop it. The pond was something you had to see to understand. It wasn't just water. It was 2 acres of dark green mirror spreading out behind the old homestead, ringed in by willow trees that drooped their fingers into the shallows and cattails that whispered in the June wind. The spring came off the mountain, off land that Floyd's granddaddy had bought when this county was nothing but farms and timber, and that spring never stopped flowing, not in drought years, not when the winter went deep and hard. It came cold and clear, and it filled the pond steady, and the pond fed Copperhead Creek, which ran east through what used to be the old Wickham tobacco allotment before somebody got the idea to develop it. Floyd knew every inch of that water. He'd stocked it himself with bass when he was 40, put in bluegill a few years later. There were turtles in there now. Big snapping turtles that had been there, for he didn't know how long, sunning themselves on the rocks in July. The frogs had a chorus at night that would put you to sleep if you sat out on the porch. Bullfrogs and spring peepers and little tree frogs that sounded like tiny bells. His granddaughter Annie, who was 8 years old and came every other weekend from her place down in Bristol with her mother, she loved that pond like it was alive, which Floyd supposed it was. He'd built her a dock 3 years back, nothing fancy, just some treated lumber and nails, but it was solid, and Annie would sit out there with her little fishing pole and catch bluegill for hours, and she'd release them back one after another, just to watch them swim away. Every morning that Floyd could remember, he'd walk down to that pond before the sun got too high. He'd wake up when the day was still dark, when the birds were just starting to think about singing, and he'd pull on his overalls and his VFW cap and make a cup of coffee in the kitchen. Birdie would be heating her own water for tea, and they wouldn't say much. They were past the need for morning words, and then Floyd would take his mug and head down the slope. The grass would be wet with dew, soaking his pant legs, and the air would be cool and perfect, the kind of air that reminded him why he'd never wanted to live anywhere else. When he got to the water, the mist was still rising off it like the pond was breathing. The surface would be perfectly still, like glass, reflecting the trees and the sky in reverse. Floyd would stand at the edge with his coffee, warming his hands on the mug, and just watch it. Sometimes he'd see the great blue heron that visited most mornings, a bird that was tall as a man, standing in the shallows on its stick legs, patient as prayer, waiting for the fish to come near. When Floyd would get close, the heron would lift off with those great wings and flap upstream, and Floyd understood. The heron had its routine too, and Floyd's appearance was part of it, and they'd both learned to live with that. The frogs would go quiet when he arrived, every one of them, like they'd all gotten a signal. Then, once they knew it was just him, just Floyd, who'd been coming down to this water for 50 years, they'd start back up again, their voices finding each other like friends calling in the dark. Floyd had a marker post he'd put in years ago, an old surveyor's stake, and he'd check the water level against it, make sure the spring was flowing right. Then he'd sit on the dock for 10 minutes, sometimes longer, and he'd think about his granddaddy, and about time, and about what it meant to hold something steady across a lifetime. This was his church before church, this quiet ritual, this understanding between him and the water. Floyd was 72 years old. He'd been born in the farmhouse in 1952, born in the front bedroom when Doc Patterson came out from town, because Birdie was in labor and the roads weren't what they are now. He'd grown up here, run this land with his father, inherited it when the old man passed in 1989. He'd married Birdie in 1977. They'd be 47 years married in October, and she'd come to this land as a bride and made it a home. She had her vegetable garden down on the south slope, kept chickens in a coop she'd named after her sister, sang in the Mount Carmel Baptist choir every Sunday, and loved Floyd in a way that was so steady and sure it had become the structure of his life. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. because this story is proof that some things are worth more than what they look like on paper. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more. 3 years ago, something changed. Somebody sold the Wickham property, 320 acres across Copperhead Creek, to a developer from somewhere up in Northern Virginia. Within 18 months, the land was parceled into 78 home lots, and the homes started going up. Mountain View Estates, that's what they called it. Split-level ranch houses on quarter-acre lots. It's all of them facing the wrong direction in Floyd's opinion, all of them new and fresh and designed to look like they were somebody's dream of the countryside, when anybody who knew the countryside knew you couldn't buy it that way. You had to be born into it. The road that ran past Floyd's place was the boundary line. On one side, his 40 acres, old and slow and full of history. On the other side, Mountain View Estates, all new mailboxes and landscape lighting and lawns cut with robot mowers. When the first families started moving in, Floyd didn't pay them much attention. The land was what it was. His land was his land, and the subdivision was the subdivision. They didn't have to talk. They didn't have to know each other. That's how it worked in the country. Then Connie Nettles moved into Lot 23. And it's a split level with a 3-car garage and the kind of landscaping that looked like somebody had printed a picture from a magazine and pasted it into real life. She was late 50s, blonde hair dyed so blonde it was almost white, styled the way city women did it, always perfect. She wore a hot pink blazer that you could see from the road, pencil skirts, heels that clicked on asphalt. She'd moved from somewhere in Northern Virginia, somewhere around Arlington or Leesburg, somewhere where land cost money and views cost money and everything was negotiated and expensive. Within 6 months, she was running the HOA, the Homeowners Association. Mountain View Estates had one, which was the first real problem in Floyd's opinion. The HOA was 78 families voting on how things should look and what could be done and what couldn't. And Connie Nettles got herself elected president immediately. She had ideas. She wanted the place to look certain ways. She wanted property values to remain high. She wanted the aesthetic of the neighborhood to be uniform and professional, and nothing that suggested that this was still the actual country, with actual dirt and actual history. Floyd found out that Connie had started making noise about the pond the same way he found out about most things. Olin Holbrook told him. Olin lived across the road, had been a mechanic until his knees went out, spent his mornings now on his porch with coffee and a newspaper, and he knew what was being said in Mountain View Estates because his daughter lived there. Olin said that Connie had called the pond a mosquito breeding ground, said it was a safety hazard. It said it looked rural and undeveloped and brought down property values. She had apparently told the HOA board in one of their meetings that Floyd's pond was the reason the neighborhood didn't feel like the kind of place where people wanted to invest their money. Floyd listened to this and didn't say much. What was there to say? The pond was where it was. The water came from the mountain. His granddaddy had filed the deed. The end. But Connie didn't see it that way. She sent him a letter in August of that year, a formal letter on Mountain View Estates letterhead with the HOA logo at the top. The letter said that his pond presented a health and safety concern. It said that standing water accumulated mosquitoes and vector-borne illness was a legitimate concern for a residential community. And it said that the board requested that he take immediate action to remediate the situation. That was the word she used. Remediate. Floyd folded that letter and put it in the pocket of his overalls and didn't call anybody back. He didn't respond. He didn't write a letter. He didn't argue. He just left it alone. The letter meant nothing to him because he had something that mattered more. He had the deed. The deed was a thing, a piece of paper filed with the government, a legal document that said what he could and could not do with his own water. The letter was just noise. The letter was just one woman from somewhere else telling him how to run his land. But Connie Nettles wasn't used to being ignored. That wasn't something that happened to her, apparently. In the spring of that year, she sent another letter. As this one formal in a different way. This one had references to county code. It said that the HOA board had voted to demand that Floyd either drain the pond, fill it in completely, or install a 6-foot chain link fence around the perimeter with proper signage. The letter said he had 30 days to comply, or the HOA would pursue legal remediation at his expense. She used that word again. Remediation. Floyd didn't respond to that letter either. He had nothing to say to it. The thing about Floyd was that he'd grown up in a time and place where you didn't negotiate with women in hot pink blazers who had ideas about how your land should look. You didn't argue with them because argument required you to believe they had a point. Floyd didn't believe she had a point. He believed in the deed. The deed was logic. The deed was law. That afternoon, after Bertie found the second letter in the mailbox and brought it to him, she went out to her garden. She'd been working on her tomatoes all morning, tying them up with twine, checking them for ripe ones, and now she went back out to weed, but she couldn't focus. She kept looking across the road, across Copperhead Creek, toward the subdivision. She could see the roof lines of the new houses through the trees. She could see the landscape lights that they had installed along the main drive, lights that came on at dusk and made the whole place look like it was glowing. Bertie knelt in the dirt next to the tomato plants and pulled weeds without thinking about it, her hands doing the work while her mind was somewhere else. After a while, she stood up, her knees cracking the way they did now, and she went inside. Floyd was in his chair in the living room, the old recliner he'd had for 20 years, reading the Farm Journal. It was a publication he got monthly, and he always read it cover to cover, kept up with the weather patterns and the commodity prices and the stories about farmers in other parts of the state. When Bertie came in, he looked up over his glasses and saw something in her face that made him put the journal down. "Floyd, that woman isn't going to stop," Bertie said. She wasn't asking a question. She was stating a fact. Floyd looked at her for a moment. Then he took his glasses off and set them on the arm of the chair. He looked at the window where the afternoon light was coming in, at the way it made the room look solid and real and full of weight. "Neither am I," he said. Bertie nodded. She didn't look fully reassured, but she looked like she trusted him, and that was the important thing. She went back out to her tomatoes, and Floyd put his glasses back on and picked up the Farm Journal again, but he wasn't reading it anymore. He was just holding it, thinking about his granddaddy, thinking about what it meant to hold a line, thinking about the fact that some things were worth more than peace. The second summer after Mountain View Estates started going up, Connie showed up at the house. Floyd was in the barn working on the gate to the chicken run, and Bertie was inside doing dishes. Connie knocked on the screen door, and Bertie answered. Bertie always answered doors, that was her way, and told Floyd that the HOA president was there to see him. Floyd came in, pulled his gloves off, and Connie presented herself as if she were somebody he should know, as if she was the kind of person people recognized. She was wearing the hot pink blazer and pencil skirt and heels, and those heels sank into the soft ground of Floyd's front yard as she walked, leaving little holes in the earth. She said she'd brought the county health inspector with her. That was her move. She was going to bypass Floyd entirely and just let authority come to him. The inspector was a younger man, couldn't have been 30, and he looked uncomfortable in the situation. Connie showed him around. She pointed to the pond and described it as a stagnant water source. She talked about mosquitoes and dengue fever and West Nile virus. She suggested that the water was not properly aerated and therefore posed a public health concern. The inspector looked at the pond, really looked at it, and then he walked the shore. He pulled out a net and took a sample. He looked at the water clarity. He checked the pH with a little kit from his bag. He watched the springhead where the water came in from underground. After about 30 minutes, the inspector turned to Connie and said that the pond was fine. He said it was spring-fed, which meant it was moving water, not stagnant. He said it was clean, clear, and properly oxygenated. He said there was no violation. There was nothing wrong with it. He didn't understand why he was there. Connie's face turned a color that clashed with her blazer. She started to argue. She said that standing water was a health hazard regardless of what he'd tested. The inspector said it wasn't standing water. He said it was a spring-fed pond system, and it was one of the healthier natural water features he'd seen. He said he'd be recommending to the county that it be protected as a natural resource. Then he thanked Floyd for his time and drove away. Connie stood in Floyd's yard for a moment, and then she drove away too. Bertie was standing on the porch watching, and she came down and took Floyd's arm. She didn't say anything, but she squeezed once, and Floyd understood that she was saying good job, that she was saying hold your line, that she believed in him and in the pond and in the deed his granddaddy had filed. Floyd thought that would be the end of it. He thought that was how things worked. You stood firm, you had the law on your side, and people left you alone. But he was wrong about Connie Nettles. She wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. She wasn't the kind of person who saw a piece of paper filed in 1923 as the end of a conversation. She saw it as the beginning of a problem that she needed to solve, and Connie Nettles was very good at solving problems. Or so she thought. If this story has your blood boiling, share it and subscribe to the HOA Trap. Because what this quiet man does next is why you don't drain a man's pond without reading the deed first. The Sunday morning, when it happened, Floyd didn't know. How could he? He was in church. He and Bertie had gotten up at 7 o'clock, as they did every Sunday morning, and Floyd had walked down to the pond as he always did, checking the water level, watching the mist rise off it in the warm summer air. The pond was beautiful that morning. It was late June, early July, and one of those June mornings where Virginia is at its best, green and soft and full of water. Floyd had stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just breathing and looking, and then he'd come back and put on his church clothes, dress pants and a button-up shirt that Bertie had ironed, the same ones he wore every Sunday. They drove to Mount Carmel Baptist at 8:30. It was a 20-minute drive into the town of Independence, and the road curved through the county the way country roads did, green tunnels of Virginia summer all around them. The trees made a canopy over the asphalt, dappled light falling across the windshield. The radio was playing gospel music. Floyd always set it to the gospel station on Sunday mornings, and the sound was warm and familiar in the cab of the old truck. When they got to the church, Floyd helped Bertie out of the passenger side, taking her elbow the way he always did, and they walked up the steps together. The church was Mount Carmel Baptist, a white wooden building that had been standing in the same spot for 130 years. It had a steeple with a bell in it, and the bell had been rung at every service since before Floyd was born. The doors were heavy and wooden, and the smell when you came in was old wood and hymnals and something that was just the accumulation of decades of prayer and singing and people sitting in pews. Floyd walked down the aisle to the third pew from the front, right side, the pew where he'd sat for 47 years. The wood was worn smooth from sitting. He knew every knot in that wood. He sat down and arranged himself, and Bertie went up to the choir loft to get ready for the music. They sang, "How Great Thou Art," and then some hymn Floyd didn't recognize, something new the pastor had picked. Bertie's voice came through clear and strong, and when Floyd listened to it, he felt the usual feeling of being rooted and okay in the world. There was a soprano next to her trying to outdo her, but it was Bertie's voice that mattered, that made the music real and true. When she sang, her face had a peaceful quality, like she was singing to something far away, something that only she could see. They stayed for Sunday school. Floyd's class was studying the Gospel of John, and the teacher was a retired banker named Hedges, who had strong opinions about the original Greek. And then they went to lunch at a little place on the main street. Bowl, a country cooking place where they served fried chicken and biscuits and green beans cooked the way they should be cooked, slowly, with ham hock, until the beans gave up and became soft and essential. Floyd had sweet tea and Bertie had coffee. They talked a little bit about Annie, who was coming to visit the next weekend. They talked about the weather. They talked about the church roof, which needed some work. They drove home at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Floyd saw it before Bertie did. He was driving, and as they came around the bend to their driveway, he saw the empty space where the pond had been. His foot came off the accelerator involuntarily. The car slowed. For a moment, he didn't understand what he was looking at. It was just a shape that didn't make sense. A crater. A muddy crater where 2 acres of water had been. He pulled into the driveway and got out of the car slowly. Bertie was saying something to him, asking him what was wrong, and he didn't answer because he couldn't. He walked down the slope toward where the pond had been, and the more he walked, the more he understood it. And the more he understood it, the more something in his chest tightened into a fist. The pond was gone. Completely gone. The water had been pumped out. The bed was mud, cracked mud, drying mud, mud that was already starting to split open under the July sun. Dead fish lay scattered across that mud. Bass, bluegill, catfish, scattered like somebody had thrown them there on purpose. The frogs were gone. The turtles were gone. The dock that Floyd had built for Annie was sitting on that mud, and the pilings were exposed, and the wood looked wrong in the open air, exposed, bare, like something that should have been hidden. The willows were already starting to droop. The cattails looked confused, like they couldn't understand what had happened to them either. Bertie had gotten out of the car and come down the slope, and she was standing beside Floyd, and then she sat down. She just sat right down on the ground at the edge of the muddy crater, and she started to cry. She cried quiet, which was the way Bertie cried, with her hands over her face, and Floyd stood next to her and didn't cry because that wasn't something he did. Floyd went very still instead. Floyd looked at what used to be the pond, and his hands clenched into fists, and his jaw tightened, and he went still the way a trap goes still, the way a thing goes still right before it springs. They stood there until the sun started getting lower. Then Floyd helped Bertie up, and they went back to the house. Floyd called Olin across the road, and Olin came over immediately, understanding by the tone of Floyd's voice that something had happened. Olin looked at the crater and said, "Jesus, Floyd," and that was all he said for a while. Then he told them what he'd seen. A pump truck had shown up at maybe 9:30 that morning while they were still in church. It was a big truck, professional pump truck, the kind they used to drain basements and pools. The operator was a guy Olin recognized, Ray Blankenship, who did that kind of work for contractors. Ray had set up the pump and put the intake hose into the pond and the discharge hose into the county drainage ditch, and he'd run it all morning. By the time Olin realized what was happening and came out to ask him what he was doing, Ray said he'd been hired to do it, that he had permission, that the woman from the HOA had told him it was legal, so Olin hadn't stopped him. He'd just watched. Olin was sitting on Floyd's porch now, turning his cap in his hands. He looked at the empty air where the pond should have been, and his guilt was written all over his face. He'd been watching that pump truck work all morning, and he hadn't done anything about it. He should have done something. He should have called the sheriff. He should have at least stood in front of the pump and told Ray to stop. "I should have done something, Floyd," Olin said. His voice was rough. "I should have called the sheriff. I should have gone down there and told him to stop." Floyd just looked at him. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling around them like dusk. Olin, it wouldn't have mattered," Floyd said finally. "She'd have come back when you weren't looking. She had a plan. You standing in front of a pump wouldn't have changed that." Olin nodded, but the guilt stayed on his face. He nodded again, slow, and then he went home, and Floyd sat on the porch and looked at the empty crater where his pond had been. The sun was setting, and there was no sound. There were no frogs. There was no splash of fish jumping. The evening was silent in a way that evenings on this land had never been silent before. Bertie brought him coffee, and she sat down beside him, and for a long time they didn't say anything. Then Floyd said, "I don't know if I can fight this, Bertie. I don't know if it's worth fighting." She was quiet for a moment. She reached over and took his hand. Then she said, "Now, your granddaddy didn't file that deed for nothing, Floyd. He didn't dig those banks and take that down to the courthouse for you to just give up. And that was all it took. That was all he needed to hear. It was like something shifted in him. The weariness was still there, the sadness about the dead fish and the empty crater, and Annie not having anywhere to fish when she came next weekend. But underneath it was something harder, something that was just going to hold the line. The next morning, Floyd went to the spare room where they kept important papers. The room used to be their son's bedroom when he was growing up, before he went to college and never really came back to the country, moved to Charlotte for work and a life that was faster and louder than this place. His high school baseball trophy was still on the shelf, dusty. The little metal player frozen mid-swing. There was a filing cabinet there, old metal thing, probably from the 60s, and Bertie sat down at it and helped him look. They found the deed in a folder marked Land Deed. It was in an envelope, protected, and when Floyd took it out, his hands were steady. It was written on paper that was old and yellowed, and the handwriting was his granddaddy's, firm and clear. It had been filed with the Grayson County clerk in 1923, and the number was written on there, and the date was written on there. It gave the Breeding family, and their heirs and assigns in perpetuity, all water rights to the underground spring that fed the pond and all the water flowing from that spring into Copperhead Creek downstream. The deed was signed and notarized and filed official. It was a thing. Bertie held it up. Here it is, Floyd," she said. The paper was old, but the words were clear as if they'd been written yesterday, as clear as if his granddaddy was still alive and standing in that room, making sure Floyd understood what it meant to own something forever. Floyd drove to the county clerk's office in Independence and got a certified copy. The clerk, a woman named Susan who'd worked there for 20 years, looked at the original and the certified copy and said, "Mr. Breeding, this is a valuable document. You take good care of that." Floyd put the certified copy in a plastic folder, and then he drove to the sheriff's office. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, it's free, and it helps the HOA Trap reach more folks who know what it's like to have somebody mess with their land. Now, back to the story. Sheriff Garland Prater had known Floyd for 40 years. Garland had grown up in this county too, in a farming family, and he understood land the way people who grow up with land understand it. He understood it as something that meant something, that had laws around it, that couldn't just be taken. Floyd sat down across from him and laid out the deed and explained what had happened. Garland read the deed, and his face did something that Floyd recognized, the face of a man who understood that somebody had made a mistake. Garland called in Dale Cornett, who was the county water and environmental compliance officer, and Dale came up from his office and Garland showed him the deed and explained the situation. Dale was younger than Garland, maybe 40s. And he was the kind of official who actually knew the law and wasn't afraid to explain it. He looked at the deed and then looked at Garland and said, "This is a clear case of property destruction and environmental violation." He explained it to Floyd the way you'd explain something to somebody you respected. He said that draining a deeded water source without the owner's permission wasn't just a civil dispute. It was a criminal matter under Virginia water law. He said that the pond, as a natural feature, was protected. He said that the destruction of it could carry fines and restoration costs that would be substantial. He said that the drainage disrupted the natural water flow that the entire subdivision stormwater engineering was based on. He said it was, in his professional opinion, a very serious mistake. Ms. Garland asked Floyd if he wanted to press charges. Floyd said he did. Garland said he'd talk to the Commonwealth's attorney and he'd need to interview Ray Blankenship and Connie Nettles and get all the facts straight. Floyd said that was fine. He said he'd like that. Garland went to see Connie on a Friday afternoon. He brought Dale with him. They walked up to her house at Lot 23, the split level with the 3-car garage, and Garland knocked on the door. Connie opened it in her hot pink blazer, and her face went through a series of expressions very quickly. Recognition, confusion, suspicion, and then something like fear. Garland explained the situation. He showed her the water deed. He explained that draining the pond without the property owner's permission was destruction of property. And he explained that the environmental damage might be prosecutable under state law. He explained that the restoration costs would likely be substantial and would be her responsibility. Connie tried to argue. She said it was a health hazard. She said the board approved it. She said it was necessary for the community. Garland said none of that mattered because she didn't own the water. She said she had permission. Garland said she didn't. He showed her the deed. He said the deed was filed in 1923 and it predated her subdivision by 100 years, and it said, right there in the handwriting of Floyd's granddaddy, that the breeding family held all water rights. He said her options were limited. She could restore the pond at her own expense, or she could face criminal charges. He said he'd recommend that she hire a lawyer. Yet Connie started to cry, which seemed wrong to Garland, because Connie Nettles didn't seem like the kind of woman who cried. She called her husband. Her husband wasn't home. She called a lawyer. The lawyer apparently told her much the same thing Garland had told her, that she was in a lot of trouble, that the deed was legitimate, and that restoration was the least she could do. If the HOA Trap has become part of your week, think about joining the channel membership. Just a couple bucks a month keeps these stories coming. Links below. Now, back to the story. Then 2 weeks passed, and it rained. It rained the kind of rain that Virginia gets in mid-July, a summer thunderstorm, the kind that comes up fast and dumps water for an hour, and then moves on. The water that used to be held by Floyd's pond had nowhere to go. The natural regulation of flow was gone. The creek rose too high. The stormwater drainage system in Mountain View Estates, which had been engineered to accept the controlled flow from Floyd's Creek, couldn't handle the new flow. The system backed up. The drainage ditches overflowed. The water went into basements instead. 23 homes in Mountain View Estates got flooded. The water got into finished basements. It destroyed carpet and drywall and personal belongings. The smell of standing water got into the houses, that musty smell that tells you mold is starting, that your home is being damaged from the inside. Insurance adjusters arrived with clipboards and cameras. One of the women in the subdivision, a woman named Carol who lived on Oakmont Drive, was standing in her driveway when the water had receded, looking at her basement. Oh, and she was crying. All her stored memories were down there. Photo albums, her mother's quilts, her father's wooden boxes that he'd made in his workshop 30 years ago, things that couldn't be replaced. Kids' toys floated through the streets, a bicycle, a plastic playhouse. Things that had belonged to children were scattered and ruined. The mood in the subdivision shifted fast. The people who had supported Connie, who had voted for her, who had wanted the pond gone because they thought it was bringing down property values, those people were angry now, but they weren't angry at the pond anymore. They were angry at Connie. Neighbors who'd supported her wouldn't speak to her when she came to the grocery store. The woman across the street from her started a Facebook group calling for Connie to pay for the damage. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Helen who lived on Maple Street, went to Floyd's house and knocked on the door. When Floyd answered, Helen was crying and she said she was sorry. She said she was sorry on behalf of the street, that she'd supported the HOA and Connie, and she hadn't understood what could happen. And now her friend Carol's entire basement was destroyed. Helen said she'd vote to remove Connie if they could, but they were going to have to do it officially, and it would take time. Floyd listened and nodded and said he understood. And when Helen left, he felt something he hadn't felt before. Not vindication exactly, but something like acknowledgement. The water had settled the argument. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for the following Tuesday. All of the HOA board members showed up. And a lawyer that the HOA had hired showed up, and about 60 homeowners crowded into the community center that Mountain View Estates had built for exactly these kinds of meetings. Connie was asked to resign. She was asked to explain what she'd done and why. The lawyer explained the liability situation. He explained that the HOA was now responsible for damages caused by draining a water source that had been deeded to another property owner. He explained that this was a very costly mistake. He said the restoration of the pond would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 to $60,000. He said the homeowner claims for basement flooding might add another $100,000 on top of that. The new board president, a man named Tim who worked for a bank, asked if there was any way to recover those costs. And the lawyer said yes. They could go after Connie Nettles for the full amount, since she'd initiated the drainage. He said they'd have a very strong case. Connie was asked to pay. She said she couldn't. She said she didn't have that kind of money. The board took a vote. They voted to pursue a civil suit against Connie Nettles for $54,000 in pond restoration costs and to recommend criminal charges to the Commonwealth's attorney for property destruction and environmental violation. But before that happened, Ray Blankenship came forward. Ray felt bad. Ray had been told by Connie that she had county approval and Floyd's permission. Ray had been paid to pump a pond. Ray had shown up and done his job and gone home. But when Ray found out about the flooding and the legal issues, Ray came to Sheriff Prater and told him about his texts with Connie. Ray's texts showed that Connie had told him explicitly that she had permission, that she had county approval, and that it was a legal removal of a hazard to the community. The texts showed that Connie had lied to Ray. The texts made the case much clearer. Connie Nettles hired a criminal defense attorney, the Commonwealth's attorney for Grayson County, a woman named Jessica Chen, who'd been handling cases for about 5 years, decided to prosecute. She charged Connie with destruction of property, which was a felony, and environmental destruction, which was also a felony, and fraud, because Connie had obtained Ray's services by lying about having permission. The charges carried potential jail time. They also carried substantial fines. The criminal case took months to resolve. There were lawyers and negotiations, and at some point Connie accepted a guilty plea on the destruction charge, and the other charges were dropped. She was sentenced to 300 hours of community service and probation, and she was ordered to pay restitution of $54,000 for pond restoration. That number, $54,000, that was the cost the environmental restoration company quoted. The HOA paid it. The board voted unanimously to cover it from HOA funds because the HOA was responsible, and the HOA had caused the damage, and the money had to come from somewhere. The new president, Tim, called Floyd and apologized. Floyd listened. He said he appreciated the apology. He said he hoped it wouldn't happen again. He said he was just going to need time. The pond restoration took through the fall and into the early winter. The environmental restoration company brought in equipment and reinforced the banks the way they should have been reinforced, stronger than before. They brought in new topsoil and cleaned out the mud. They put in a proper system to manage the springhead so that the water flow was optimized. They stocked it with fish, bass, bluegill, catfish, the whole system. and they seeded the banks with native plants. They put in the willows again, and the cattails, and the rushes, and all the things that should have been there. By the time winter came, the pond was full again, and the spring was flowing, and everything was working. Before the restoration was complete, Annie came to visit. She was 8 years old, and she came to the property with her mother on a Saturday afternoon. When they arrived, Floyd brought her down to the empty site to see what they were working on. Annie walked down to where the dock had been, and she saw the cracked mud, the equipment scattered around, the workers putting in the banks with heavy machinery. She walked out on the cracked earth to where the deepest part of the pond had been, and she just stood there looking at it. She didn't cry. She wasn't the kind of kid who cried easy. She just stood there, quiet, looking at all that absence. Floyd came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. They stood together for a while, and then Annie asked, "Grandpa, where did the water go?" "Somebody took it," Floyd said. "Somebody we didn't know took it." "Why?" Annie asked. "Because they didn't understand," Floyd said. "Maester, they didn't understand that some things matter more than they look like they matter." Annie nodded, like that made sense to her, like the logic was simple and clear. She looked at the cracked earth again, and she asked, "Is it coming back?" "Yes," Floyd said. "It's coming back." "Promise?" Annie asked. "I promise," Floyd said. She looked at him and accepted that. The way kids accept promises from people they trust completely. And something in Floyd settled then. Something that had been broken. This was his granddaughter. This was the future. The water would come back for her. Floyd and Annie went down to the pond on a Saturday in October, after the restoration was done, and they stood on the new dock. Floyd had built her a new one, better than the first one, better engineered, more solid. And they looked at the water. Miss Annie asked if the frogs would come back. Floyd said they would. He said frogs knew where they belonged. He said water knew how to find itself. Annie cast her line and caught a bluegill on the second cast, and she released it back, and the fish swam away, and she smiled. That was really the end of the story, in a lot of ways. The pond was back, the water was back. The frogs came back by spring, their chorus returning like they'd never left. The turtles came back. The ecosystem that had been interrupted came back to itself, because that's what water does. It finds its way home. But there was more to it than just the water coming back. There was the evening when Floyd and Bertie were sitting on the porch, just after dark, and they heard it. They heard the frogs starting up, the whole chorus at once. And it was like something had shifted in the world. The bullfrogs with their deep voices, the spring peepers with their high calls, the little tree frogs that sounded like tiny bells. The sound came up from the pond and filled the evening, and Bertie grabbed Floyd's arm and squeezed. "Listen," she said. "Listen, Floyd." And Floyd listened. He listened to the frogs and the water and the sound of the evening being right again. For the first time in months, the evening sounded like home. The sound was full and complete, and it meant that everything that had been broken was healing. It meant that the water had come back not just as water, but as life. Not just as the thing itself, but as the whole system of things that belonged to it. The frogs knew. The frogs had come back because they knew. Connie Nettles put her house up for sale in December. She moved back to Northern Virginia, back to Arlington or Leesburg, or wherever she'd come from, somewhere where land wasn't alive and history didn't matter, and the only thing that mattered was whether things looked expensive. She sold the house at a loss, about $47,000 below what she'd paid for it, which seemed like the universe settling accounts. The new owners of Lot 23 were a family from Roanoke, younger people, and they planted a garden and started going to the community center and being actual neighbors to the community they had moved to. The HOA, under Tim's leadership, issued a formal written apology to Floyd. The apology acknowledged the damage caused, expressed regret, and promised that the HOA would respect all existing property rights and water rights in the area. The apology was unnecessary. Floyd knew he was right, but he appreciated it anyway. He folded it up and put it in the pocket of his overalls, which is what he did with important papers, and he carried it with him for a while. A year after the pond had been drained and then restored, Annie was sitting on the dock again, fishing, and Floyd was sitting beside her, and Bertie brought lemonade down from the house. The pond was perfect. The water was clear. The spring was flowing. The surface reflected the sky. Floyd thought about his granddaddy, who died in 1956, who'd never had to worry about hot pink blazers or subdivisions or HOA boards, who'd simply dug the banks and filed the deed and trusted that the deed would mean something. His granddaddy had been right. The deed had meant something. The law had meant something. The property had meant something. The water had meant something. And Floyd had held the line, and the water had come back, and Annie was catching bluegill again, and the evening was full of sound. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you that still water runs deep and so do property rights, please share it. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more stories about folks who knew their land better than anyone who tried to take it. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you came home from church and found your pond drained dry?